When people discover Advaita Vedanta, they often wonder where they should start, what scripture they should study, what should they learn, what should they focus on. Now today I want to speak to you about my top 5 books of Advaita Vedanta. Now, I want to give a few honorable mentions before I get into my top 5, because my top 5 are what are called Nididhyasana texts. Now, these are the higher teachings of Advaita Vedanta. These are the teachings where you're on the cusp of enlightenment or you've gone into the depth of enlightenment. And that's what Nididhyasana is. And so I'm going to speak about 5 Nididhyasana texts that build the core of the higher teachings of Advaita Vedanta. But before we get there, I want to just mention a few honorable mentions. First of all, the Prasthanatrayi. If you know what the Prasthanatrayi are, they are the core of Vedanta. Now, that builds the premise of the 3 schools of Vedanta, right? Which are Advaita Vedanta, not strict non-dualism, what I'm going to speak about today. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, which are the teachings of Ramanuja, which is qualified non-dualism, and then there's also Vaita, the teachings of dualism from the teachings of Madhva. But we are talking about the teachings of Shankara and Gaudapada today, the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So all 3 schools interpret the Prasthanatrayi in different ways, right? And so to build a foundation before we get into the deeper Nididhyasana text, you need to read the Prasthanatrayi, in my opinion, even though when I learned, I started with the Nididhyasana text. But nevertheless, the Prasthanatrayi is made up of 3 books. So the first one is the Upanishads. So this is a complete version of the Upanishads. There's 4 volumes here from the great Swami Nikhilananda. Now, you don't have to be crazy like me and read all 4 of these. There is actually a principal Upanishads by Swami Nikhilananda. Highly recommend that one. And so that's part of the Prasthanatrayi. The Upanishads is one. And the second part of the Prasthanatrayi is the Bhagavad Gita. Now this again is a translation by Swami Nikhilananda. I get most of his scriptures because of his authority on the text, his enlightened perspective on the text. He was a really great teacher and could translate into English beautifully the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So the Bhagavad Gita is obviously really well known. So this is part of the Prasthanatrayi, which builds the core teachings of Vedanta, the 3 schools of Vedanta. And then there's also the Brahma Sutras, which I don't have on hand right here. And so those 3 are kind of the foundation of Advaita Vedanta and Vedanta in general, right? And so that's why it's called the Prasthanatrayi. And then another honorable mention just before I get into my top 5 is the Tattva Bodha. Now, a lot of people believe you should read the Tattva Bodha before you engage in the Nididhyasana text. When you look at and you read some of these texts, it's either or, right? You could read the Tattva Bodha and it's a pretty great text and has a lot of high teachings in and of itself that are probably not much better or worse than some of the ones that I'm going to speak about. But from a classical perspective, if we're taking the approach of Advaita Vedanta, they would say you should read the Tattva Bodha before you get into these deeper teachings. So as I said, the Prasthanatrayi of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras and the Tattva Bodha. Now, we come to my top 5. Now, these are not in any sort of particular order, but the reason why I've ordered them the way they are is because it might be a good progression for you to go through them in the order that I present, right? And so the first text is often considered the foundation of Advaita Vedanta, and that is the Mandukya Upanishad Kataka, right? And so the Kataka, the commentaries and the verses come from Gaudapada. This is often termed as Gaudapada Kataka, right? And Gaudapada is considered the first great Advaita Vedanta teacher, and he was Shankara's guru's guru. And so Shankara himself has commentaries in here of the Upanishad and of Gaudapada's Kataka. And it's a great text. This is I would say, one of the greatest texts in the entire world. It's something I've read many, many, many times. I should actually make more videos of the Mandukyu Upanishad Kataka. But like I said, some people actually believe this is the foundational text of Advaita Vedanta. I'm not going to argue with that, but there are a lot of other texts that you could say build the foundation of Advaita Vedanta in the same way, and some people may say even better in other ways, right? But a lot of the philosophy and the core terminology is covered in the Mandukyu Upanishad Kataka like no other text. And so I highly recommend this one. Look, I could have this last, it could be the last one you should read, but I just thought I'd mention it first because of the idea that it builds a lot of the foundation of Advaita Vedanta. Now, the next one is the Atma Bodha, self-knowledge, if we were to translate that into English. Now, Atma Bodha speaks for itself if you understand Sanskrit. Atma, Atman, right? The undifferentiated consciousness that you are, which is identical with the ultimate reality of Brahman. And so, Atma Bodha, Bodha being the knowledge, the Bodha of the Atman, right? And so this again is a Swami Nikhilananda translation. And this gives you everything you need to understand the nature of your Atman. This is an amazing text. You know, it's one of my personal favorites, the Atma Bodha. And there's just so much in this. The introduction by Swami Nikhilananda goes on for quite a while and is a teaching in and of itself before you actually get into the actual Atma Bodha text. But this is a beautiful text. And again, it just accentuates the teachings of Shankara, this text. It's such an amazing text. And it gives you the tools, as I said, to understand the nature of yourself, or Atman, if you will. Now, the next one is the Avadhuta Gita by Lord Dattatreya. Now, this again takes it, I think, a little further, right? We're going further and further in to this Nididhyasana zone, you could say. And so the Avadhuta Gita was one of the books that personally transformed my life. When I read this, it changed the game for me on a spiritual level and my understanding of what reality is. This is the book that did it. Now, the beauty about the Avadhuta Gita is it's a very thin book. You could probably read this in an afternoon, and you could read the next day as well if you want. And so it's an amazing text, beautifully translated, this one by Swami Chaitanananda, but I also recommend Swami Abhayananda's translation of this text as well. But this is a game changer. And as you all know, I speak a lot on the channel about the Avadhuta Gita, the depth of this book and its transformative effects and its ability to kind of pull the rug from underneath your ordinary assumptions of what reality and yourself are, right? This will definitely pull the rug from underneath you. Now, coupled with this one is the next one. And these two, like including the Avadhuta Gita and the next one I'm going to speak about, are probably two of my favorite texts within Advaita Vedanta because of the story aspect within these texts, but also getting into the direct teachings and just the way that they're translated are absolutely beautiful. And that is the Ashtavraka Gita. This one's called the Ashtavraka Samhita. This is actually translated by Swami Nitya Swarupananda. And so this is an amazing translation, one of my personal favorites of the Ashtavraka Gita. And so the Ashtavraka Gita basically is the story of the sage Ashtavraka and the king Janaka, right? And so they have this dialogue between each other, which is an amazing dialogue. And it's all about the nature of Brahman itself, right? It's just a direct teaching. And Ashtavraka takes Janaka to this place, right? Takes him to this place that all that exists is Atman. So Atman is Brahman, right? And so it's a constant contemplation and deep spiritual teaching on the nature of reality. I absolutely love this. And to couple with this is Thomas Byram's translation. This is actually called The Heart of Awareness. This is an amazing translation of the Ashtavakra. I've got both of these. I always carry these around with me. But recently I've been reading a lot more of Thomas Byram's translation. It's a beautiful translation. Thomas Byram actually was a student of Neem Karoli Baba, right? So he's a student of Neem Karoli Baba in Uttarakhand in India. And this translation is amazing. I've made a few sort of cinematic videos using some of the text from Thomas Byram's translation. And I highly recommend getting both of these, to be honest, to give you sort of a perspective on the Ashtavakra Gita. And also, like with any other text too, it is good to have a look at other translations if you have the time and money to get sort of a different idea. And if they're the same, almost the same, then you're in a deep contemplation nevertheless, right? That's better than being on TikTok or playing with your phone, obviously. Now, the last text, but definitely not the least, is the Ribhu Gita. Now, why I left this last is because the Ribhu has a sort of forceful, repetitive stanza, ancient format to it. And so if you're not accustomed to Advaita Vedanta and you come across the Ribhu Gita and you start reading this as your first book, I would say some people would likely drift away. If you have no sort of spiritual aptitude for what this knowledge is, then it's highly likely that you're probably going to pull the pin and move on and go to something else. But if you've gone through the text in the way that I said and the way that I mentioned with the other ones, this will make more sense if you go through that process. This is actually a deep meditation. The Ribhu Gita is a deep meditation. It was one of Sri Ramana Maharshi's favorite texts, was the Ribhu Gita, right? And this one's actually from Ramana Ashram, this version of the Ribhu Gita. This is the Sanskrit version. I also have the Tamil version. And so, like I said, there's a very repetitive and forceful format throughout the Ribhu, but it's designed like that as a meditative process. You got to remember that back in the ancient times, they used to chant this, right? So they're chanting it in a repetitive way to keep their mind in that state. You find this in other texts, even in Buddhist scriptures, like Nagarjuna's Middle Way. And so you find that sort of repetitive chanting stanza format in some of these texts. But I highly recommend the Ribhu Gita, because once you understand Advaita Vedanta and you read this text, it puts you into a meditation. Part of my own personal practice a lot of the time is after meditation every morning, I'll read, a few pages of a text. And a lot of the time I will read the Ribhu Gita because it just puts me in a place which sets my day in the right direction. And that's the power of the Ribhu Gita. Now, as I said, there's no real one way you should read all these texts. You can read them in any order that you want. But as I said earlier, start with the Prasthanatrayi before you get into the ones I recommended. Make sure you understand Vedanta before you go into Advaita Vedanta, before you go into Nididhyasana. Read the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutras, and then get into the Nididhyasana text. But you can bypass the Prasthanatrayi, as I did when I was younger, and went straight to the fountain, you could say, of eternity, and just started reading the Nididhyasana text. For some, they can do it. For some others, you might need a little bit of time understanding the text from understanding Vedanta first itself. And so I will leave the links to all of these books in the pinned comment and in the description. Please let me know in the comments, what are your favorite texts from Advaita Vedanta or just world literature in general? And which ones of these have you read? What are your favorite ones of these that you've read? What are the favorite ones that I've recommended on the channel that you have read? Please let me know. I hope you're all safe and sound, and I'll see you in the next one. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.